everyone. I hope you had a nice break. Our next presentation is going to be with Crystle Lampitt. Crystle is a graduate counseling intern for Resolve. Crystle Lampitt is a TV anchor turned psychotherapist in training. In her previous career, she worked in front of and behind the camera as a host of a morning television show, a sidelines reporter, a model, a producer, a videography, editor for more than a decade. Wearing many hats and smiling all the time while working around the clock led to burnout. Her physical health, mental health, and close relationships began to suffer, so she decided it was time to go back to school and pursue her first love, psychology. Crystle now sees therapy clients through her internship with Resolve as she finishes up her clinical Master of Social Work degree. She specializes in trauma and treats adults grappling with issues related to PTSD, CPTSD, anxiety, depression, codependency, abuse recovery, body image, multi-ethnic identity, highly visible careers, adoption, biological parent discoveries, and a vast spectrum of difficult experiences that come with being human. Though it has taken many years to get here, Crystle is committed to living a healthier life driven by authenticity and empowerment, and she hopes to support others on their journeys to live a fuller and happier life. Crystle's presentation for the day is Finding Sanctuary in the Body and Mind, a neuroscience and trauma-informed approach.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for that very nice intro. So I'm Crystle, and I'm in my final year of the MSW program at KU, and I'm also a therapy intern at Resolve right now. And I am so thankful to be here talking to you all today just about how to take better care of ourselves and, why we struggle with self-care sometimes, why we struggle to create change, and basically just the role that our nervous system plays in all of this so that we can really start to shift and show up the way that we want to and feel good doing it. So, and I really am appreciative that I've been asked to speak today, because if you knew me, you would know just how big of a shift this is for me. So it was not that long ago. I really felt like I was basically a shining beacon of what not to do to take care of yourself. So I'll kind of start with a little bit of background on me from when I really decided to shift into the mental health field from working in television. So this part of my story kind of starts in my, mid-20s. Life really appeared to be going pretty well. I had just gotten my dream job as a television host at a local TV station. I had bought my first home. I, was really putting down roots near family and friends. And I thought I worked really hard for these accomplishments and was proud of them. And like many people, I felt like, okay, I'm on track. I'm doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing. So you can imagine my surprise one day. Of course, this isn't the whole story, otherwise we'd be done right now. One day I woke up and I went to the mirror to fix my hair, as you do. And the first thing that I noticed was that I had a huge bald patch on kind of the back of my head. And when I say bald, I mean there was like not a single strand of hair on this. It was about the size of, a little bit bigger than a golf ball. And I had no idea. I remember in that moment even kind of just looking around the room like, how does a chunk of hair go missing? Like, this is bizarre. So of course, I called my mom. Well, I took pictures first, called her, and I'm like, what is happening? Is this a thing that happens when you turn 25? Like, what is going on? Did this happen to you? What is happening? And she's like, no, hasn't happened to me. So I go to the doctor and got tested for just everything under the sun. And I ended up being diagnosed with an autoimmune condition called alopecia areata and 2 other autoimmune illnesses. And with autoimmune disease, basically what happens is your immune system attacks its own healthy cells. So in this case, it was my hair follicles, and then it was going to be my mucous membranes and also my skin. So I was going to have just these reactions and these strange flare-ups that were just going to be kind of like a part of my life from now on. And I was told there's no cure, but the symptoms are very manageable. You're not dying, at least not for now. But once you do have an autoimmune disease, it's very likely that you will get another one or many other ones, because there's between 70 to 80 autoimmune diseases. So, take your pick, everything from lupus to rheumatoid arthritis, some really serious health implications. But as of now, my doctors
bless them, they were really trying to reassure me like, this is okay. But I was not having it. I remember thinking, absolutely not. I'm in my 20s. I thought I was pretty healthy. This is not what my 20s were supposed to look like. And I just refused to live a life where my hair could just fall out randomly. That was so strange. You know, I was supposed to be dating and meeting people. And what if I was doing the newscast one morning or a live, show and my hair fell out? I didn't understand what this meant for my future. And, but genuinely, like when I really look at the fears that I was going through at the time, it was, what if I got sicker? What if I couldn't work anymore? And what if I lost my house, lost my job, lost everything? And I think that's what a lot of people with chronic illness, they really start to question, what is going to happen now? And we don't think about this, happening in our 20s very often. But it was happening, and I just remember thinking, I have no idea where to go from here, because I had a job that required me to be up at 3 a.m. some mornings to do the morning newscast, and sometimes I'd have to work until 11 o'clock at night to cover local Sporting KC games, sporting events and that sort of thing. And I really had to be pretty much available 24/7 for my job, and it was, a job that I really, really cared about. So it was a pretty hard blow. But when I got past some of the initial shock and then that initial denial that I went through, I realized that I had actually been ignoring symptoms for a really long time. So years prior to this, I had actually been struggling with chronic fatigue for several years. I had a lot of sleep problems, insomnia, a lot of digestive issues. I would also have panic episodes and at times periods of depression and anxiety. And kind of like that morning when my hair fell out, I thought like, is this normal? Is this the normal part of, being an adult? And I really did. I thought that this was like a normal part of having stress responses because I had a demanding career and I had grown up responsibilities now, I had to pay a mortgage. So I tried everything in my power really to fix this. I of course went to my doctors. I took all the medications that they prescribed to help kind of calm my immune response. I tried lifestyle changes, every diet, every anti-inflammatory diet, every workout plan, whatever. I tried it. I went to a bunch of medical specialists, holistic practitioners. I was really looking for someone to just like fix my body, and I really wanted the answers. And of course, I was just going down the whole WebMD rabbit hole. I was constantly Googling things, trying to help myself out. And, all of these physical treatments and lifestyle changes, they did help some. There was some subtle improvement, but nothing really significant or sustainable. So I finally got to a point where, years into this struggle, I realized my mental health was just suffering profoundly. I really thought my body is betraying me. This sucks. This is terrible. And after several $1,000s and several years into this journey, I decided, you know what, maybe I need to stop seeing medical specialists who were all telling me the same thing, like, you're probably not dying right now, but yes, these symptoms are your life now. And I thought maybe I need to stop going to all these medical specialists and instead see a therapist, because at least my mental health felt like maybe that was something that I could at least start to work on. And it was interesting at the time. I really didn't believe that I needed to seek mental health support because I was very functioning. I mean, I went to work every single day, no matter what, no matter how exhausted or how much pain I was in, I went to work. And I really was under the impression that you had to be like suicidal to see a therapist. But I finally went. I decided, okay, I'm going to do this. And I really didn't realize this at the time, but this ended up being the catalyst for me to completely shift careers, eventually go back to school at the age of 30 to pursue my graduate degree in clinical social work. And then now I get to work with my own therapy clients through some of their challenges. So big shift has happened in these last few years. But, when I went to see a therapist and I really started to focus on my mental health, this really interesting thing happened. Both my psychological and physical symptoms began to improve.
And I should add the caveat here, like, no, I did not cure autoimmune disease. I wish I did. Despite becoming a graduate of the University of WebMD, I did not cure autoimmune disease. I still have them, but I don't have flare-ups the way that I used to. And more importantly, I really think the way that I relate to these diagnoses and the way that I relate to myself has shifted a lot. And that has really improved my quality of life. So with you today, I would just like to share some of what I've learned. And again, you know, mental health and health, these are such complex topics. So this is just one perspective that has been really helpful for me and that has been helpful for some of my clients as well. So I think we kind of need to rethink mental health a little bit. When I chose to go back to school, I chose a clinical social work program, in part because I like the way that mental health is treated in this field. And so I'm going to share this with you a little bit. Here we go. So in social work, we take a person in environment approach. And so here's kind of a look at what that looks like. A person environment approach, or PI theory, means that we don't ask people necessarily just like, what's wrong with you? You know, we ask, what has happened to you? What has influenced you? What systems and environments have contributed to your current situation? So in addition to biological factors, which are very important, of course, we also consider how our histories and our environments also influence our behaviors and our symptoms. So we're not just defining people with a cluster of symptoms and pathology. And the belief here is that, you know, besides your biological factors, there are all of these other factors like your environment that you do have the capacity to improve and to change. So I really like this perspective because it was also really aligning with what neuroscience was finding. And that is that the brain is neuroplastic. We can genuinely change our brains and the way that we respond to problems and stress. And we can shift, you know, even some of the most stubborn habits. So in my research, I was also discovering that there was a huge connection between mental health conditions and chronic illness. So more specifically, in my case, I was looking up around autoimmune diseases. There were all these connections between stress and trauma-related disorders and autoimmune illness. So one of the most recent studies actually that was just done earlier this year was done on military personnel. And it found that those who had a history of PTSD had a 60% increased risk of developing autoimmune disease compared to those without a history of PTSD. And, you know, I always thought years ago, well, I don't have PTSD, I don't have trauma. I don't even have anxiety or depression. I was like very strongly in denial. Because again, you know, I was highly functioning. I was still able to go to work and I was still able to fulfill my many obligations and responsibilities. And I just thought you had to be completely impaired to have a mental condition that warranted seeing a therapist. I didn't know you could just go to a therapist just because, you know, and I think that's a really common misconception. And, you know, a lot of mental conditions, they really do look very different in different people. And so I think that the way that mental health is going now is really understanding conditions as existing on a spectrum. And so it's not so much about, you know, like, yes, your functioning is a huge part of it, but it's not just you have trauma or you don't. There are spectrums and there are different ways that this shows up for different people. But, you know, at the time, the word trauma really did not resonate with me. So until I discovered the work of Dr. Francine Shapiro, and she is the creator of a trauma treatment modality called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's used very frequently with veterans now. It's funny to see how far we've come in mental health, because EMDR used to be thought of as kind of this like strange, controversial method, and now, you know, 20 plus years later, it is the gold standard for what's used with a lot of veterans who have PTSD. So Dr. Shapiro defined trauma as, she kind of divided them into two groups. So the capital T traumas are what you would typically think of, those, you know, shock traumas, war, natural disaster, assault. And then there are the little t traumas that are no less significant. They just might be less apparent, especially less visually apparent. And these could be, you know, life transitions or early childhood experiences that were overwhelming that we didn't quite process. And the way that she frames it is really helpful. She sees the big T traumas as a huge wound on our bodies, and then the little T traumas are like lots of little cuts, but you can bleed out from both. And so it's very significant to, it's very important to treat them both as equally significant. And so once again, I kind of had to look at my life, you know, and get really honest with myself. And once I got past my own denial, I realized, you know what? Yes, I had experienced both big T and little t traumas in my life, but I was too ashamed to acknowledge them for a long time because I was operating under that, you know, context, social context of being perceived as weak. I didn't want to face some of these fears. So I just told myself, you know what, I'm fine. And I ignored all of my feelings. I kind of, if you guys have ever seen that meme, I should have put it in my PowerPoint of, it's a dog in a comic strip and he's holding a mug and the house is on fire. And he's just sitting there like, I'm fine. Everything's fine. That's kind of how I was at that time. But now, literally, my body was forcing me to take a more serious look at my life and my mental health. I mean, literally, visually, it was starting to, you know, my physical symptoms were starting to get worse. And so I thought I should probably start listening. Thankfully, at the time, I did choose a trauma-informed therapist who was trained in EMDR, and I was able to kind of dive into my inner world with a lot of support, and that was really, really helpful for me. And you know, when I started to learn about the physiology behind some of my responses and some of my symptoms, I just felt so much less crazy. I realized this isn't about crazy, you know, this is about survival. And Dr. Bessel van der Kolk was a huge influence in this area because so he defines trauma as anything that overwhelms our nervous systems. So it's more about the way that our nervous systems respond to an event and less about the event itself. So comparing your traumas, you know, it's really useless. I mean, we do that, and it kind of makes me think of whether you drown in 7 inches of water or 7 feet of water, you drowned. So, but we have a tendency to do that. You know, we want to compare like, oh, that wasn't that big of a deal. But it's about the way that your nervous system responds. And so you might be thinking like, well, okay, is something wrong with my nervous system? Why is my stress response so sensitive? And truly, I believe that all of our nervous systems naturally have different capacities for handling stress. Because if you think about the way that we evolved in small tribes, you know, we evolved through biodiversity or neurodiversity. So when our ancestors were living in small tribes, you know, having some members who were more detail oriented, more sensitive to changes in the environment, they likely would have detected threats from a mile away that other members may not have even noticed. So I kind of, you know, thought of this as like, okay, I do have a slightly more sensitive nervous system. And I kind of came around to thinking of my anxiety as more of a protector rather than an obstacle. So it truly does. It lets me know when I have an anxious response. It lets me know when something in my environment might be unsafe. So I have a moment to kind of pause and reflect. So whether you identify as having trauma or not, you definitely have a nervous system. So I think understanding the way that it responds to stress can be really, really helpful to understanding our mental health. And when we look at the big picture here, you know, we know that the mind and body are connected. And we know that if you only address the physical side of things, or you only address the psychological side of things, that may not improve or resolve all of our issues. So we have to kind of examine, how are we operating in our daily lives? What in our environments might be contributing to our physical and mental states? Because we know that you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. So a little bit more about the nervous system. You know, I think what's important to hold here is just that mental health is not just psychological, it's physiological. So we are wired for survival, and our symptoms, our behaviors, they are often in service of meeting a survival need. And they do make sense often in the context of keeping us safe. So, you know, nervous system 101, many of us probably learned in school, we were taught about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So when we feel safe and calm, for example, our parasympathetic nervous system is running the show, we can rest and digest. But if we're met with a threat, our sympathetic or fight or flight response turns on so that we can mobilize and protect ourselves from the threat. But anytime your limbic system is activated, so that's the middle part of the brain, that's the amygdala in the brain that is detecting threats. It's kind of like the smoke detector. Your logic system is offline. So the logic system being the thinking parts like the prefrontal cortex at the front of our brain. So that's why it's really hard to solve problems and have rational conversations when you're in a heated argument with your spouse, for example. You know, those fight or flight responses are kind of getting activated, and the thinking parts are like, see ya. So according to Dr. Stephen Porges, and he created the polyvagal theory, he's a scientist and a psychiatrist. He actually found that the nervous system is a little bit more nuanced than fight, flight, and rest and digest. So he discusses our vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body, as being connected to various important organs. So we know it influences different organs depending on the way that our vagus nerve is activated. And so I'm going to kind of show you a little bit more about that here in a diagram. Maybe not. I'm going to keep talking and we'll figure it out. So he added this third option. So instead of just fight or flight, he added another option called freeze. And let's see, it's slide number 2. There we go. So here's kind of a way that you can look at it. So besides just rest and digest, he uses the phrase safe and social, or what he calls the ventral vagal response. And he's referring to the different branches of the vagus nerve. So there's, fight, flight, and rest and digest. He added the option of freeze or shutdown. And the freeze or shutdown response is called the dorsal vagal response. So we have dorsal vagal and ventral vagal. Now, according to polyvagal theory, when we feel threatened, we're going to reach for fight or flight or safe and social. And a really easy example of this is, think about when you're a kid and you get afraid or you're scared of something and you run to mom, right? We're wired for connection. We go to other humans to stay safe. So that's our safe and social state. But if neither of these options are available, fight, flight, or safe and social, we are going to, within milliseconds, our nervous system is going to decide, nope, mobilization is not an option. So it's going to go into a state of shutdown or freeze. And this immobilized response looks like feigning death. You can see at the top of the screen here, dissociation, numbness, depression. And the freeze response, I see this one in particular with a lot of sexual assault survivors. And what's so important about this is that they often shame themselves for freezing up in really truly what could have been a life-threatening situation, when it's actually just an automatic response. I mean, that it causes your muscles to actually physically freeze up. So there isn't a need for shame, but people tend to go there. They go into, why didn't I fight? Why didn't I run away? But genuinely freezing up in that moment may have been the best survival option. And you do see this in the animal kingdom. It's a little bit more obvious. For example, lizards will play dead to deter a predator. So in that state of freeze, it can be very protective, because from a survival standpoint, that may either deter the threat, or if we're about to be eaten by a predator, I mean, worst case scenario, thankfully this isn't the situation for most of us today. Worst case scenario, if you're about to die, most of us would kind of want to dissociate, right? And not really be there, because I don't know about you, but I don't want to feel that pain. So dissociation can actually be a really helpful response. And another interesting thing about being in this acute stress response, so fight, flight, or freeze, is your body adjusts to accommodate them. So there are actually structures in your middle ear that will shift to pick up certain frequencies more than others. So for example, really high frequencies and really low frequencies. And the theory posits that this was so our ancestors could better hear threatening noises like growls or screeches. And then less emphasis, was placed on picking up those mid-range frequencies like vocals and speech, which we think of with your social engagement system, right? That safe and social place where we're just having a nice, pleasant conversation. So when you are in fight, flight, or freeze constantly due to chronic stress or unresolved trauma,
it is just exhausting for your body, especially the adrenal glands and other systems that are impacted by the vagus nerve. They just get worn out, as you can imagine. Nobody wants to be in this state constantly. We usually would be able to calm down and get out of it. But sometimes what we experience as like a depression or anxiety can actually be a stuck survival response, because ultimately our nervous system's main job is to keep us alive. And, you know, when people say they feel like they're broken or there's something very wrong with them because they are having these symptoms, I like to point out, you know, the very fact that they are currently alive right now is a sign that there is something very right with them. So their nervous system is doing its job, but it may be doing its job with some survival mechanisms that we don't always like or that we find unhelpful later in life, because, you know, most of us don't want to feel anxious or on high alert constantly. But what's really interesting about this is these sort of survival mechanisms, they start really early in life and they can become ingrained. So when we are just born, for example, we are so vulnerable and we are nowhere near having a fully developed nervous system. So we really need our caregivers to help us regulate, to help us soothe. We don't have the ability to do that for ourselves yet. So that first 6 months of our lives, our brains develop especially rapidly. And they actually don't technically stop developing until around the age of 25. And that's when our prefrontal cortex comes fully online. That's that rational thinking part of our brain that's in charge of a lot of executive functioning. So these very early years of life, especially the first 3 years when our nervous systems are developing, are crucial to our future health and well-being. And during those early years, you know, we don't really have a lot of agency. We don't have a lot of options, but we will do whatever we can to ensure survival. And there is a really interesting study on mirror neurons in early childhood. So mirror neurons are the neurons that we use often in early development to mimic other people's facial expressions. And it's typically thought of as a form of pre-verbal communication. So typically, we would be mimicking mom's face, right? Well, when the researchers actually measured what was going on in mom's brain chemistry, they found something really interesting, is that as mom was observing her child mimicking her facial expressions, they found that it triggered the release of oxytocin, which makes sense, right? Oxytocin is known as the cuddle hormone or the love hormone. And it also, this action also released dopamine, which most of us know as like the reward or the motivation hormone. So mom is just, you know, loving seeing her baby copy her facial expressions, and this is fostering this connection. And this also led researchers to theorize, you know, what an excellent survival mechanism for the baby. Because as long as baby is keeping mom interested and paying attention, you know, and it's triggering all these feel-good hormones for mom, maybe mom won't leave. Because that abandonment would ultimately be the greatest threat to our lives. You know, hundreds of years ago, there was no foster system. If you were abandoned, that was it. And technically that can still be true for today. So it was really interesting, you know, for researchers to find that mirror neurons and this mimicking of facial expressions, it may not just be a form of pre-verbal communication, but also a way to keep connected to mom. So our entire nervous system truly is built around keeping us safe. And at that age, our caregivers quite literally equal survival. And that's really all we know for a long time. So if you can imagine just, you know, how scary it would be for a baby with basically no agency, no options in these early years of life to be living with caregivers who are chronically absent. You know, they may be struggling with mental health issues of their own. They may be grieving a loss, or even, you know, 10 to 20% of mothers have postpartum depression in that first year after giving birth. And when we look at the ACEs study, so the ACEs study is a really popular one, which was really, it was a groundbreaking study that linked adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, to poorer health outcomes later in life. So you might actually see yourself in some of the items on the ACEs survey. So basically the ACEs survey is what they gave the participants of the study, and there were 10 items on this list. And some of the items were kind of obvious big T traumas that we might think of, right? Like abuse. And then some of the other items were the less apparent traumas, like emotional neglect, enduring parents divorcing, which is what's the divorce rate, like 50%, or living with a parent who is struggling with their mental health. So these are actually very common occurrences that a lot of us have maybe gone through. So when we don't get our early needs met, or we go through some of these adverse childhood experiences, you know, most kids will protest and they'll cry out, but if they are chronically neglected, they may fall into kind of a collapsed or freeze state to help them dissociate from the neglect. So as we get older, you know, we do need to individuate, and we do need to develop our own sense of self so that we can be independent in the world. And I really love Dr. Gabor Mate and the way that he puts this. He says it so succinctly. He says we have two basic needs, authenticity and attachment. And when authenticity threatens attachment, attachment trumps authenticity. So in other words, you know, at a young age, attachment is the top priority because it is survival. Even the development of our individual authenticity, or that sense of self, develops in the context of relationship. You know, we learn who we are based on our interactions with the environment. So essentially everything exists in a relational matrix. We are born in relationship, we are injured in relationship, and we often heal in relationship as well. So often our parents are tasked with supporting us as we individuate, of course, at a developmentally appropriate age. But if they are not available, or our environment is unsafe, or we experience a traumatic event that's never processed, we develop these adaptive survival strategies. And that's what Dr. Lawrence Heller calls them. But these adaptive survival strategies get us through difficult times. And these strategies, you know, you'll see them kind of later. They can be things like fawning behaviors, people pleasing, perfectionism, or we can develop strategies like codependence, hypervigilance, hyper self-reliance, you know, that sense of I can't trust anyone but me. And in the context of what we endured, these strategies may very well make sense. So for example, if as a kid getting perfect grades increased your sense of connection to your parents, you may learn, oh, you know, perfectionism equals self-worth equals love equals survival. So the trauma in the survival brain is very black and white. It's all about snap judgments. It's about good, bad, safe, unsafe, because when we feel threatened, we don't have time to think about all the other possibilities. And also at a young age, we don't have the capacity to understand nuance. So this will usually become pretty apparent, I feel like, more so in adulthood when we experience those adult relationships. Again, the people pleaser, the compulsive helper, you might run yourself ragged trying to solve other people's problems or keep the peace. Or you might just be kind of looking at your life like there is so much chaos. Things aren't working for you the way that you want them. Maybe there's just one stubborn pattern that you just haven't really been able to shift. And that can be a sign, potentially, that there is unresolved trauma, or just that there is nervous system dysregulation in general. So that sounds like really terrible news, like, okay, we're all doomed. But the good news is we are very resilient. So these early attachment traumas or later in life traumas, they can be repaired with corrective parenting, or as adults with our own reparenting. But all of this starts with safety, because some of us may still be operating with old adaptive survival strategies. And Stephen Porges says that, you know, safety is really the key to healing trauma. But I would say, you know, creating safety is just the key to our mental health in general, at least when we're getting started. And I'll kind of show you here just quickly here we go. So Maslow's, just kidding. Next slide. Okay, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and again, this is a very basic, simplified look at some of the needs that we have as humans. And you'll notice at the very bottom, of course, is physiological needs like air, water, food, shelter, sleep, and then safety needs is just above that. And I kind of think they go hand in hand, because without safety, you really don't have anything. So when we can create safety, we can start the process of shifting. But that means means literal, physical safety, and it also means social connection, because we are wired for connection. We do need other people to survive. And neuroplasticity means that we can create new neural pathways and new learning, but it's much easier to learn when our brain isn't hijacked by our stress responses or our trauma triggers. So in other words, when we have trauma or chronic stress, our nervous systems may be dysregulated, and that means we just don't have the full access to the thinking parts of our brain. So where do we start with safety? This is, there are a lot of ways to do this, but I like to think of a dysregulated nervous system as a kind of chaotic house, more specifically, a house in the Netflix show Tidying Up with Marie Kondo. So if you have never heard of Marie Kondo, she is like a decluttering and organizational guru. So she wrote the book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And, it must have resonated with a lot of people because it became a bestseller all over the world. So on her show, she helps stressed out families reorganize their homes and reclaim a sense of manageability and calm. And it's really a pretty big task because you'll see in these homes families who are just really struggling to get along with each other. Each member has their own frustrated feelings. One person might have a hoarding problem, there's stuff everywhere, and they just really are not functioning well because they can't find anything and they can't seem to problem solve because their world, their homes have just become overwhelming. And so when Marie comes into the house, the first thing she does is kind of unexpected. She'll gather up the whole family, with all of their disgruntled feelings, and she'll ask them to sit down in a shared room, like the living room, for example. And she'll often sit on the floor. She'll kneel on the floor like she's doing in this picture. And she'll say, I want you to thank your home. And you can see the family members in this moment kind of looking at each other like, what? And she'll ask everyone to participate. She'll ask them to close their eyes and thank the home for keeping them safe. And this alone, this recognition of the home being a supportive structure that has kept the family alive and safe, often brings people to tears because they genuinely have never seen their houses as a home or a haven. Their homes have largely been a place of stress and disorganization and judgment. And, this is how a lot of us, I think, feel about our own bodies and our own nervous systems. So this first step already starts to shift the way that the family functions. And then, as the house gets reorganized, all these new options become available. So literally, new hallways, or what I like to think of as new neural pathways that they couldn't see before, open up. And all the family members with all those difficult feelings, those uncomfortable experiences, they actually start to become less judgmental because they're learning how to be seen, how to express needs, and they really start to untangle the way that they've been living their lives. And Marie is sort of there just as a guide. She is very curious about these issues and these feelings, and she just kind of helps create a safe space for the family members to be curious about their own experiences. So no judgments required. And I think, the best therapists can help us feel safe enough to explore some of our own experiences and judgments and beliefs with curiosity. And as a part of this process, Marie will actually invite family members to look at a lot of their old items, right? So for a lot of people, these are clothes that they've outgrown, maybe junk that they've hoarded, or stuff they've forgotten in the basement. And rather than shaming them for having so much stuff, she teaches them to just notice and hold these items and to decide, if they are helpful or sparking joy for them currently, and if they're serving them in some way. And if they're not serving them anymore, she asks them to also thank the items and then let them go. And I think, if some of you cleaned out your attic, you might find items that make no sense to you now, but they did at one time. So I like to see these old items as kind of those adaptive survival strategies, the things that may have kept us safe at one time, but that we no longer need. And when I thought about this, one of the first things that came to mind was like those Jinko jeans from the 90s that, you know, the really like had the big flared wide leg, and they were really cool at the time. And they may have helped you, you know, fit in at one point, but then you're kind of realizing now, well, that's not really your style and you have no need for them anymore. But they did help you make friends and fit in at one point. And so you're recognizing, you know, what those genes may have represented for you a long time ago, and how that adaptive survival strategy has helped you. Once you realize it and you see it that way, you can also let go of them. And you may realize, you know, I'm not driven by fitting in anymore. I'm driven by, I want to be more authentic. So maybe I'm ready to let go of the Jinko jeans and all sorts of fun stuff that you might find in your attic. So as each person in the family kind of learns to notice and navigate their frustrations, they notice and hold these old items or these ways of functioning. Each room actually just becomes more organized. And part of this is that, you know, memories are filed in their designated appropriate photo albums or photo frames. Data and paperwork are stored in the proper file cabinets. Repairs are made within the home and between family members where they're needed. And when all of these things are considered and organized, the entire home and the family can start to respond differently to the challenges in life. So of course, you know, the best part of all of this is that you can see it happen in 45 minutes on Netflix in one episode, but in real life, this process usually takes much longer. And it is much more complicated, but the framework, the general sort of framework is the same. And I think when you understand your inner workings and you even learn to thank those difficult patterns or those bad habits, you know, for keeping you safe, you can start to shift them. And you get to decide, you know, whether you want to work with your nervous system or against it. So, you know, one thing I think that comes up a lot is shame. And you might be really tempted to shame those old adaptive survival strategies out of existence instead of taking them and letting them go. And that may even work sometimes, right? Because these very judgmental and critical patterns or negative habits, you know, they didn't develop for no reason. So yes, shaming ourselves may lead to compliance, but rarely joy. And if we want more joy, we have to start with more safety so that we can have greater functionality and new and different options for the ways that we relate to ourselves and the world. And, you know, even if we've been injured in the past and even if we've had difficult experiences, just as we can reorganize and update our houses, we can do the same for our nervous system. So literally, obviously, you cannot do this inside with a house, but starting with some of the basics of safety, starting with practicality, we really have to look at the actual safety in our environments. So context matters here. You know, all the inner work and healthy habits, they're not going to work if you're living in unsafe situations. They just won't. This is, of course, assuming that you have the resources to get out of unsafe situations, which unfortunately is not always the reality. But if you're, like, for example, in an abusive relationship, it's like your nervous system or your house is on fire, but instead of putting out the fire, you're going to go take a bubble bath, or you're going to go like do some deep breathing and yoga. And that's not going to work. Like, it's just, you have to actually create safety. So that means, you know, we have to have boundaries. We have to live and work in safe environments. And in areas where we don't have that control, because trust me, I would love to, you know, have all the answers for how we fix the planet. But generally speaking, we can't control everything. So we have to create boundaries with what we can, and we have to control the controllables. And one way to do this is to literally, you know, have boundaries with yourself and look at what are you exposing yourself to, what's entering your environment that is unhealthy for you. One way that I did this recently with the pandemic, because it's, you know, the pandemic is everywhere, like it's hard to escape, and I don't have the cure for COVID. But I do have control over what enters my environment. So I realized when the lockdown first started that I was getting all of these notifications on my phone from a news app about the death count and the infection rate, and another school or sports team, like someone was getting infected and people were dying. And I just remember having to sit down and think, like, I'm aware there's a pandemic. I am aware. Go outside, everybody's wearing masks. So I had to turn those notifications off for myself. And it, you know, wasn't about ignorance. It was just about protecting my peace. And so that was just one small way that I decided I'm not going to let this pop up unexpectedly throughout my day and create this sort of anxiety reaction in me, just whenever, you know, the news station decided to put that out there. So these are just ways, small ways that we can create a little bit more safety in our actual physical environments. And then when we're looking at inner work, I like to starting with a top-down example, which means starting with how our mind influences our body. I like to start with just simple psychoeducation. So everything that I've been talking about here today, understanding the context for how your nervous system works, you know, how your inner workings work. And I also really liked bibliotherapy. So I'm a big fan of books, and, you know, I have some books at the end of this that I'll share with you. But books can really help us just immerse ourselves into a different perspective. So if you like reading, or you're working with someone who likes reading, books can be a really great place to start here. And then, you know, of course, affirmations and gratitude, anything that you can do to fill yourself with positive messages and healthy messages. In the therapy world, CBT and CPT, so that's cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive processing therapy, are really helpful cognitive therapies that take a top-down approach. And this kind of goes along with that, but I really like this phrase, I'm telling myself. So especially if you have like a really heavily critical inner voice, and you, especially if you feel yourself or you hear yourself saying things like, you know, I'm not good enough, I'm lazy, I'm stupid. You know, we do this sometimes, and sometimes it's hard to be aware of. So I'll even have my clients sometimes write down everything that they've thought about themselves in a day. And it's incredible to see, like, wow, I'm really mean to myself sometimes. So telling yourself, like, instead of buying into that, using this phrase, I'm telling myself, and then inserting the judgment can create a little bit of distance. So instead of buying into, you know, I'm lazy, it would be, I'm telling myself I'm lazy. And without even changing the thought, we can start to change that we relate to the thought. And I kind of see it as befriending the inner critic and inviting it in for tea. Like, you know, when you meet someone that you don't really like at first, but then you kind of get to know them a little bit, or you just approach them with a little bit of curiosity, and you realize that they're actually not so bad. You haven't actually changed the person, but you've changed the way that you relate to them. And so I think that's a really helpful way to just think about our thoughts. You know, they're not always true, they're thoughts. And when we say, I'm telling myself I'm X, Y, and Z judgment, we can see it, you know, we can see it as a pattern of behavior. And then we can also start to appreciate them. Like, okay, maybe I'm telling myself that I'm lazy has helped me in some ways. And we can start to Marie Kondo them, see them, thank them, and start to let them go. Now, one thing about cognitive approaches is I think that sometimes they aren't always available until we've done some deeper trauma work and regulation work, because our nervous systems are so dysregulated that the thinking parts of our brain may still be offline. So that makes it really hard to respond to things like language, learning new skills, or shifting our beliefs. I know this was definitely the case for me. So I had to start with a bottom-up approach. And that just means looking at how the body influences the mind. So bottom-up approaches help us really reconnect with our bodies, which can be an important piece for trauma survivors or people who have just ignored their bodies and feelings for a long time. I mean, I 100% was doing this. I literally was ignoring my body's symptoms. I was ignoring my feelings. I was just bypassing all of it for years to survive, right? To work a job that required me to work 15 hours a day sometimes. And so when we look at a bottom-up example, one of these that Stephen Porges really recommends is the 4-7-9 breathing, or just taking long exhales. So this is kind of a way to give us almost like a backdoor into shifting our experiences. And breathing is an important one because typically when we are in fight, flight, or freeze, we're taking really fast, shallow breaths. So when we take a long breath with a long exhale, we're sending the signal to our brains that we are safe. So a really simple one is 4-7-9. Inhaling for 4, holding for 7, and then exhaling for 9. And that one I really, really like for when I'm having trouble sleeping, because it just helps your whole nervous system calm down. And then another one, this one might annoy some of you parents who are watching, is to listen to mid-frequency music, and like really sing-songy Disney music is good for this one. And I swear this is according to Dr. Porges, not me, but you're like, I don't want to listen to Frozen for, ever again in my life. But it might help you get unfrozen. So with listening to sing-songy music or just those mid-frequency music like vocal tones, it helps our inner ear, or that middle ear that is, listening for those threatening noises, to kind of tune in to, oh, vocals, social engagement. This is like another person's voice, which can be really soothing. And our nervous system does respond to other people's voices. So listening to mid-frequency music, and I think sometimes that's why we like having the TV on in the background, is just because we feel like there's some social engagement. And then of course, spending time with safe people that you love. So knowing who is safe in your life, who you can go to whenever you need, that's just a huge part of activating that social engagement system. But if you don't have a person around, you can always just listen to some awesome Disney music. And then grounding techniques, weighted blankets, I love. I think that there's something about weighted blankets. I don't know if it's that maybe we were swaddled when we were kids, but you'll even see this on like an accident scene, where emergency responders will put a blanket over a survivor or somebody who's been through something really traumatic. So there is something about a blanket or a weighted blanket that really does offer us that comfort and that safety. And I also really like soothing scents. Sometimes I just do this. I'll just be on my couch and like people know not to disturb me. Like I'm under my weighted blanket. I've got my candles lit, and I really like my soothing scents. I'll even carry like a bottle of lavender in my purse, because it just helps me to kind of ground. And then a really simple one is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that's 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So when we do these things, we are not only protecting ourselves from the damaging influence of our environments, by using those healthy boundaries, but we're also increasing our nervous system's capacity for helpful states and healthy experiences like safety, comfort, compassion, connection, love, and we really build up those resiliency muscles. Some people just, call it mindfulness, and there is definitely a lot of evidence behind that. Dr. Herbert Benson over at Harvard calls these types of mindfulness practices accessing the relaxation response. And he really believes strongly that that complements our body's natural capacity for healing. So a few takeaways from all of this. I know I kind of gave you guys a lot of information, but many of our behaviors and our patterns, they do actually make sense when we look at them from the context of survival and our environmental influences. Another piece here is that, we find safety in support. So when you're really struggling, I do hope that you won't wait as long as I did to seek support. You do not have to be completely non-functioning in life to see a mental health professional, and that right therapist for you that makes you feel safe, that really creates that safe space for you, can provide a lot of safety for your nervous system. And that can be a really big part of recovery. And I think seeing trauma as an injury means that we can heal and we can recover from it. And it's a much more hopeful way to view trauma. And, when we create safety and become curious about these survival strategies instead of judgmental, we can start to thank them and we can start to let them go. It's kind of, I think of it kind of like the training wheels on a bicycle. When we learn how to navigate without them, then we can let them go. But I think sometimes we shame ourselves and we try to get rid of things way too soon before we're ready. And that does not help us in the long term. Most importantly, recovery, change, it's not about perfection. You may not like everything about the way that your body or your thoughts respond to certain situations. And as far as your nervous system is concerned, it's like happy because you're alive, right? But you can have a perfectly livable, lovable, and safe home without it being perfect. So regulating our nervous systems is really more about creating flexibility and building resilience than perfection. And I think that's a really important one to remember. And then, for me, I really found that, just to give you a quick update on, my story, addressing my own trauma and creating safety for myself was sort of, it was almost like the missing ingredient, because I needed everything, I believe. I think I needed the medical attention and the physical support, but I also needed the psychological support. And it felt like that was sort of the missing ingredient to some of my recovery efforts. And I'm just happy to report that, you know, my psychological symptoms have significantly improved. So did most of my physical symptoms. But it really took a shift from, you know, my body is betraying me to my body is protecting me for me to start to recover. And it's great because I no longer have to, you know, go to a bunch of doctor's appointments. I don't have to get steroid injections into my scalp anymore or wear clip-in extensions to hide all the bald spots. I don't actually lose hair the way that I did several years ago. So that has actually resolved, knock on wood. But, you know, I still do have these autoimmune diseases and I do still have autoimmune markers. I just don't have flare-ups the way that I used to. And it's all very manageable. So I kind of see this as, you know, as I started to feel safer in my own body, my body actually became a safer place. And, you know, I'm still a work in progress. I still struggle sometimes, but I have way more compassion for myself now. So I really hope that just all of this information and this perspective can help you have greater compassion for yourselves and the people that you work with. So thank you all so much for joining. And I don't know how we're doing on time, but you guys are welcome to ask questions, maybe?
Yeah, so,
Yes.
all right. Sorry. All right, Crystle, thanks so much. I really
Yes.
appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing your story with us. It was very impactful.
Thank
for
you.
me. I do have a few questions, and then we'll probably wrap up.
Okay, awesome.
But my first question was, is there a specific experience, a statement, intervention that initiated a shift within you that you thought was really helpful when you were on your journey?
Like a specific statement. You know, I would say that it really started with going from my body is betraying me to my body is protecting me. I think like even that and I didn't buy into it at first because like I said, I had the block with the top down experiences where I was like affirmations did nothing for me. And I love affirmations and I hope if they work that everybody uses them because I do use them now. But for a long time, it was like words just didn't, you know, I felt like I was lying to myself.
Yeah.
So I couldn't lie to myself, but I had to kind of think like, you know, smaller shifts like I'm learning to be compassionate. I'm learning to accept these diagnoses. And those little statements slowly turned into, instead of my body is betraying me, my body is protecting me.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yes, very good. And then another question I have is, how do we as helpers identify or recognize dorsal vagal versus ventral vagal states in our clients and help them recognize it within themselves?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. You know, and so much of this has to do with self-awareness, which I think where therapists can come in is super helpful because you can tell if someone is in a shutdown state where like, I'm going to show you guys real quick, but like I'll have clients say like, you know, I was so afraid. I was so mad.
Yep.
I was so angry. And you'll see it, you know, because their affect, their actual way that they are presenting is very frozen. I mean, it literally, and you can see, you know, in body language, you can see collapse, you can see shutdown. And so that's a way to recognize, and even just being able to reflect that back. Like, you know, I'm noticing when you're saying this, I don't see a lot of expression on your face. Or like, you know, were you angry? Because I'm seeing that you look sad or that you look kind of just down or restricted is a kind of a good word. So you can notice this in your clients pretty obviously, I think, through body language. When people are trying to notice it in themselves, I find that to be a little bit harder depending on their levels of self-awareness. So sometimes a mindfulness practice like tuning into your body every day for just like 5 minutes can help you get in touch with like, oh, I have a pain in my stomach. And sometimes we really have to do that to practice tuning in. This is a really silly one, but I've even told clients to notice when they need to go to the bathroom and immediately go to the bathroom when that happens, because we get so good at ignoring our basic biological, physiological needs. And so even taking the time to notice, like whenever you need to go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom. When you need a drink of water, take a drink of water. And so that we can slowly start to notice like, oh, wow. And then I think that slowly shifts into yeah, I was feeling really tense, you know, or I was feeling really stressed, and that's what that feels like in my body. But being able to explore some of that in session, and then also encouraging clients to notice it outside of session with their biological responses. They can journal about it, they can write it down, or they can just as simple as recognizing when they have to go pee. It's like, there you go. Okay, now we're getting a little bit closer to connecting with our bodies.
Exactly. No, I think that's a great intervention.
Mhm.
One of the things that you said that just stuck with me, and I've heard it for some reason, it resonated today, was isn't it about crazy?
Yeah.
It's about survival.
Yes.
That's really critical to the entirety of your
Yeah.
presentation, is that we're built for survival, and you mentioned that over and over
And
again.
and the idea of crazy is that's not it.
It's just not. I think we internalize that a lot.
We make it about our character flaws, and we make it about, and again, like, I think going back to that, like, I get where we get frustrated, and I get frustrated with my own adaptive survival strategies. I totally do. Like, I still find myself judging myself at times, and I think, oh God, really? We're still doing that? And then I judge myself for judging myself. You know, we do that. But when we're able to see it as coming from a neuroscience, like a physiological perspective, and from a trauma-informed perspective, we realize it's just a lot more about survival, and we don't have to internalize that. It can genuinely be, in some capacity, this strategy has helped me in some way. And for whatever reason that's coming up, instead of going into what's wrong with me, we might even ask ourselves, what do I need right now?
Yeah.
What do I need to feel safe? And what can I do to create safety? And that's where those exercises can help, or just even noticing, like for me, that was a huge shift, just noticing like, wow, I'm feeling kind of panicked. What's
Yeah.
going on? What do I need right now?
Yeah.
And just getting into the habit of asking yourself that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I think this is an excellent presentation. Just a couple things before we wrap up.